Welcome everyone to your 5th consecutive PowerPoint deck of the day. I've got 2 tests for you. Everyone stand up. Come on. I'm not your typical presenter. All right. This is actually a test for me to get to know you guys a little bit. So on a scale of 1 to 10, let's say 1, you've written just a hello world Java program, then 10 is you're someone like Jason Hunter who wrote the book on servlets. But if you're 1, I want you to just kind of have your hands clasped like this. Don't be, shy. And 10, just stand on top of your chair, spread eagle, and say, I'll know who the experts are, and I'll ask you questions after the presentation. So everyone, 10, 1, somewhere in between is between 1 and 10. Go ahead and show me what y'all's Java expertise is. Oh, not bad. No one's standing on the chairs, though, so good. Good, not bad, I guess. All right, second test. Go ahead and sit down. You can stand if you'd like. It's fine. Second test, you're going to see a couple of slides in the next couple of slides, and it's a bit of a humor test. And, you'll probably get the gist of it once you see them. A little CSS humor. Okay, I like this crowd already. Hip, hip, hooray. No? All right. Yeah. I spent an hour trading with product management on all these jokes. I'm picking out the best ones. This one's a bit more sophisticated, but laughter. 1, 3, 2, 1. All right. Got a couple giggles. So I know I have a sophisticated audience here, somewhat. I'll probably bring down the level of sophistication a little bit. I was told I couldn't curse before this brief, so I had to take out all the dirty jokes right beforehand. What you see in front of you is a toasted marshmallow milkshake. And yes, it is delicious. My family and I go to a burger joint. I'm from Washington, D.C. I live in the Virginia suburbs, and there's a burger place that we now call the Toasted Marshmallow Place. And we discovered these, and we're like, oh my God, these are the greatest dessert ever. And, being the amateur chef that I am, I said, I'm going to try to make these at home. So I found a recipe online. And one of the steps was to gently brown the marshmallows in your oven. Of course, who can't mess up who can't brown a marshmallow? I've browned so many marshmallows in campfires I can't count. But unfortunately, it's a little bit more difficult than what you anticipate. So after I put the oven fire out and opened the doors to get rid of all the smoke, we didn't have toasted marshmallows that night. So what I could have really used is someone from the Toasted Marshmallow Place come in and say, this is really the best way to make these. So I want you to consider me your chef for the next, hopefully, just 30 minutes. If I go longer than that, start throwing things at me. But I'm just going to give you 3 recipes using our Java surface area that you can go back and take to your teams today and be more productive as a development team. Okay? These are 3 recipes that myself and a group of people here at the company have, I wouldn't say I'm a professional chef, but I'm pretty close. Paxton Hare, where are you? He's a professional chef. He's a professional Java chef as much as he wouldn't admit it. But we hope that you can take these recipes back to your development teams and just become more productive. So let's start. Before I dive into those recipes, those of you that are new to MarkLogic, this really is just kind of a foundation for you guys. I want you to regard MarkLogic as just one big black box. I go into customers and they're like, we've heard great things about MarkLogic. I got to go out and hire a bunch of xQuery or server-side JavaScript developers. No, you don't. We have a REST API that sits on top of MarkLogic, and then you can treat it like a black box. Probably about 75, 80% of your application, most of that capability you could build your application right off of this REST API. Now, you'll probably eventually have to write some server-side code to get to that point, but knowing the REST API will give you that foundation so that when you do have to write some of that server-side code, it's a lot easier to make that transition. But on top of that, most of our customers have a lot of enterprise Java developers. Like it or not, Java is the #1 programming language on the TOB index. And it's used everywhere. And it's got a nice ecosystem of frameworks and things to help you out. So our engineering has put together this Java client API that sits on top of this REST client API and gives you kind of an ecosystem for all you Java developers out there to become productive in MarkLogic. So this is kind of the stack that I like to reference. And really, the Java surface area, if you're new to MarkLogic, is a great kind of gateway drug to start using MarkLogic and really getting to understand what its capabilities are. So the first recipe is build and deploy. Of course, this is how many times do you build and deploy your little development environments every day? I do it a lot, okay? Just to preclude that this recipe, the Java client API has quite the history. We started in version 6. We start from version 4 because that's about the time when I started, and that's when my point of view. The Java client API came out in version 6, and it's numbered 1, 2, 3, 4. So with MarkLogic 9, we're on version 4 right now because it started relative to version 6. So whenever you're talking or downloading the particular version of the Java client API, that came out in MarkLogic 6. You've got other Java-based tools, Content Pump, which if you're not familiar with, I advise you to, that's a lot of people's first dance into ingesting data. We got Corb, which is a batch transform tool that everyone uses. And one of the things that came out around that MarkLogic 6 timeframe was the management API. This is just an extension of the REST client API that allows you to deploy application servers, deploy databases, configure your security. And there's just an HTTP wrapper around this. And so in the documentation, you have a need for some configuration coordinator to take all your configuration off disk and push it into these REST client APIs, or these management REST APIs. And in the documentation, to demonstrate that, they use curl, they use bash shells to say, I want to push this JSON configuration on this endpoint. Engineering also has a MarkLogic Python API, and this is just a wrapper around the management API. And you can run Python commands, again, through the management API. And that's the best standard practice for deploying through your application is through this management API. That's going to make sure you get version control and configuration management across your development team. So, of course, since Java is a very heavily used tool in the industry, there was a wrapper developed called the ML App Deployer, which is a wrapper around the management API. And the thing that was missing after we kind of conceived of this wrapper was a configuration coordinator. Now, we could have written one from scratch, but I'm all about being lazy and saving time. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a good programmer because I Google and copy and paste all the time. But we discovered a tool called Gradle. Now, how many people, just a quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with Gradle? Okay. If you're familiar with Ant, that was kind of the preclusion, but it's kind of like a command line Swiss Army knife that allows you to do a bunch of stuff. I didn't say the curse word yet. And then what Gradle provides you are a bunch of plugins that give you another group of set tasks that you can execute from the command line. Okay. So what we created was a plugin called the MarkLogic Gradle plugin. It will deploy your configuration over those REST API points, and it just expects that configuration to live in a certain folder. It picks it up, pushes it to the HP client. Okay. So for those of you that want to get in the rhythm, how many people are familiar with loading the modules database, right? Usually you want something where you can just, every time I make a code change, that modules database gets loaded automatically. One of the tasks within the MarkLogic Gradle plugin is the ability to watch a certain file directory and then load that modules database. Saves you a lot of time. So it's all about shortening that developer workflow. Run automated testing. So that's the first recipe. Now, for those of you, I have a GitHub project which outlines all the details and references to all this stuff. So just bring the attention on me, watch the pretty pictures, and then I'll give you guys links afterwards to show you where you can find more details on this stuff and just examine it at your own leisure. So when you're running a local deployment, usually you're going to have an HTTP app server, a modules database, and a content database. And you're going to have some forest associated with that. That's a typical configuration. But you're usually running up some sort of full stack application. Usually there's a user interface that lives on top of there, and you're doing local testing, and you might be running some sort of workflow, adding documents, modifying them, and all that's happening in your content database. Now, of course, one of the things that is very popular today is continuous integration testing. Code a little bit, test, code a little bit, test, and not run just one test, but a suite of tests. Now, you run into some conflicts if you've got both your continuous integration and a local stack deployment on your local machine. So there's a need to have two deploys, both a local deploy that's powering probably some sort of user interface, and then a second deploy which is used exclusively for continuous integration testing. So you get in this habit of test, delete, repeat, right? Because upon the execution of every test, you want to wipe that database clean to get it back to a kind of a null state. So you're running this test, delete, repeat type of configuration, and you've got one deploy for continuous integration, one for local testing. Now, one of the libraries that I reference in the cookbook that I'll provide to you guys and gals, we have a series of helper tests using Spring, which one of the features that it provides you is before you run your test, it'll delete your content database. Okay, so that if you want to run continuous integration testing, it's just a matter of extending a helper class, and then the context configuration up top is going to contain the information of how you make your database connection. So what's your host, what's your port, username, password that you're going to use to execute all those tests. Okay? So that's running automation testing. Finally, loading data from a relational database. How many people have loaded data into MarkLogic? Just a quick show of hands. How many people have used Content Pump to do that? Okay. So Content Pump is a great tool. Came out MarkLogic 5, I believe. And it's like a Swiss Army knife of batch processing programs. I went through the documentation before I gave this brief and counted the number of batch processing programs that Content Pump executes. And there's about 13 or 14 of them. And they do anything from importing files off your file system into MarkLogic to taking an aggregate XML file and chopping them on every child element. I can copy data from one database to another. I can export data out. So there's a lot of capability. So it's like a Swiss Army knife of batch processing tools. But once you get down into a project, you get to a point where you get to a batch processing program that doesn't quite fit what Content Pump does. So what you end up doing is writing your own custom batch processor to execute something like loading data from a relational database. Because out of the box, we don't do that. What I've seen before is I've seen people write stuff from scratch. I've seen people who will dump all kinds of data to the file system and then load it with Content Pump. So there's kind of a variety of things that happen in between. So I'm giving you a recipe that kind of dictates or suggests what you should do when you come across some of these custom batch processing jobs. There's a feature in MarkLogic 9 called the Data Movement SDK, which is a part of the Java Client API that's going to help you with these type of custom batch processing jobs. Imagine, if you got Content Pump and you peel away the command line runner, you peel away some of the other stuff and get to the actual API of loading data asynchronously in a performant manner. That's kind of what Data Movement SDK is. And couple that with the capability of something like Corb, which is if I have to run a batch transform across a subset of documents, Data Movement SDK is that bundled up together. So why am I, data movement SDK is probably like on the data integration set of features is probably usually like the last one indicated. I would put it up top because, it really does open up a whole new feature set for a lot of Java developers who have to run custom batch processing. But typically, some of the things that you have to be wary of when you're running batch processing, and it's usually too late before you realize it, but you have to remember all these quality attributes of a batch processing job that you sometimes just forget about until your batch processing job is running for 12 hours and all of a sudden it just dies. And you don't know why. You don't know which record it, fell over on. But Data Movement SDK, one of the nice features about it is that it will give you status, it will give you performance, it will give you some element of reliability. What happens when, transactions are occurring on the database the same time you're running your batch processing job. How can I, run a batch process on a particular set of documents at a particular set of time? So these are the features that are offered through Data Movement SDK. And just to give you kind of a very high level description of Data Movement SDK, imagine there's a class called the Data Movement Manager. Okay, it's like a remote control. Okay, and it's basically saying start and stop my job. It's like a garage door opener, open, shut, start, finish. Okay, and from that you create a batcher. A batcher is nothing more than writing data to your database or querying a subset of documents. And once you do that, it's going to asynchronously send them to a bunch of job threads. Okay, it's going to take a batch of documents that you select. So I can set that batch to whatever number, maybe 100 documents or 50 documents, whatever is unique for your hardware. And it's going to farm them off to these job threads, and then if you've got 3 hosts in your configuration, if it's got 6 hosts in your configuration, Data Movement SDK is going to handle that. Hey, how many hosts are in the cluster, and I'm going to distribute all these threads against all those hosts. So typically, if you're running a custom batch job, you're having to worry about all this stuff. You really don't want to. Believe me, I've done it myself, and it's just a pain in the, if you know what I mean. You also have the feature of these listeners. So let's say that I finish a batch, and I want to, write another document in the database that indicates that, hey, this is the status of this job at this point in time. So you can use listeners to kind of event listeners where you can take some sort of action upon a job starting, a batch finishing, and various other events. And this is just another kind of sequence diagram, step-by-step sequence of what's happening underneath the hood. Okay? Yes, ma'am?
Is it actually handling data being written to the database as your batch job is running? How does it deal with that?
How does it deal with?
The new data that is accumulating in your database.
So one of the features that you can have is you can say, I want to run a batch processing job at a particular snapshot in time. So for those of you that are familiar with merge timestamps, if you set the merge timestamp to say at a certain value, you can say, I want you to run this batch processing job at this point in time, so that when new documents are added to the database, those essentially get ignored, okay? Because they didn't exist past that timestamp. And so you have this kind of a snapshot feature where you can say, run this batch processing job at this point in time.
So you can run it almost as a delta. Can you technically then also say between this time and this time anything new?
Yeah, so
Just as a delta?
Yeah, so there's 2 types of batchers. There's a write batcher, which is responsible for basically taking data outside of MarkLogic and pushing it in. And there's a query batcher, which can take a structured query. And a structured query is the Java equivalent of a CTS query. Or if I want to have a temporal constraint, a spatial constraint combined with some term constraint, or any combination thereof, I can pass that in and say, my query batcher, retrieve all the documents that satisfy this query. And that's what a query batcher is for. And that's going to return a set of URIs. And from those URIs, now you get some cool things. You can say, all right, now I want you to just delete all those URIs. Or I want you to transform all these URIs into another format, or I want you to write all this as a CSV file. It doesn't matter, okay? So that's really what the listener's part is going to provide to you. All right. A little short demo, just to prove that I'm not lying to you guys. And then, how are we on time? I wanted to keep about 10 minutes. I'm a little bit over that now, but. All right. Like I mentioned before, I have all the code and examples and the 3 recipes on my GitHub project. Oh. All right. As I mentioned, the GitHub address, that's the only thing that you want to copy. That will give you, I'll give you the audience time to take a picture, write it down. But this is going to have the 3 recipes that we've gone over today with reference, kind of background reading reference, the version of MarkLogic that you would need, along with some of my own commentary of how this came to be. So go ahead. Would you like me in the picture? Yeah. Vanna White? Anyone? All right. What's that? Yeah. So this is intended to, how many of you guys run continuous integration in your development shops? All right. So part of the challenge is for a brand new MarkLogic install, which is what I have. I'm running a Docker container, and it has a brand new MarkLogic install. And what I'm going to run is a series of commands. I'm running 3 tasks. Anything with the ML prefix means it's a MarkLogic task. ML init, whenever you install a MarkLogic database for the first time, there's some initialization in the security databases that have to occur. So that ML init is going to trigger those initializations of those prerequisites. The ML install admin, again, there's some additional security addition. Yeah, one of the things that sometimes my IP address changes on me. Yep, that's what happened. I swear, and it I checked it right before I came in here. So, did y'all hear about the programmer who lost his job? He couldn't get a raise. Get it? A raise. $99 little bugs of code, 99 bugs of code. Fix one down, compile it around, 106 bugs in the code. I like to sing that to my kids when they're going to sleep. And they usually say, "Daddy, stop singing." Did y'all hear about the MarkLogic admins that went into the bar? They left because they couldn't find a table. Yes, finally. You guys are a tough room. And I'm running out of jokes. as I was saying, ML init initialize your database. ML install admin is going to initialize your security database. It requires an admin username and password initially. That's going to give a default admin username and password. And ML deploy is going to take the configuration that would normally live in a version control system, and it's going to push all that configuration into the database. So it's going to create 3 databases, one for my content database, one for my test content database that would be used for continuous integration, and then a modules database. And finally, it's going to create a couple of app servers, some forest, and all this is configurable. So you can create a database with a predefined set of range indexes or geospatial indexes with certain parameters spelled out. And anyone else know any good jokes? Knock, knock. Java. Get it? Garbage collection takes so long to respond. I should have waited a couple more seconds for that one. So this takes about 1.5 minutes to execute. That means that we'll get to the beer later, Ruth. I don't know if people are wanting to be waiting for that. Gradle test. There's again, there's a plugin, there's a task for the Java plugin that'll run through all of my integration tests. So before, I didn't have QConsole working. Here I've got my 3 databases. Gradle test is going to do a few steps. This is a Java plugin, so it's going to compile all my Java code. It's going to run all the tests that are annotated within my test directory. And these tests are just running a couple of unit tests that are inserting documents into the database. One of the nice features about Gradle is that it will generate a little report of all your tests that either passed or failed. And finally, let's see. I'm using a in-memory database called HyperSQL. I'm just loading some customer data in a relational database. And using the data movement SDK and I've been a fan of this batch processing framework called Spring Batch for a while now, and we've made some extensions to it so that this is all about writing less code. And so we've been writing a lot of our relational database to MarkLogic type of flows using Spring Batch because it facilitates that whole end-to-end type of capability. And one of the things that we can do with Gradle as well is create a program. So the install dist is another plugin called the distribution plugin. And what it's going to do is it's going to package up the main program that I have in my source code and create an executable with it. So it's going to have a nice package with a bin and a lib folder that I can then execute and port to other machines as well. Again, that gets created under this build directory. And finally, I'm going to execute that program. Again, as I said before, I'm a copy and paste guy. So these are the features of Data Movement SDK. A lot of the status is provided with the document manager, and it's going to give you some idea of where you are in your batch processing pipeline. And if I go back to Query Console, you'll notice that I've got all these new customer documents that came from that relational database. So using this template, for those of you that are new, and I wish I had someone give me these tutorials when I first started, was, you could use this as kind of a template or a program starter kit for you all who need to run. It could be a mainframe, it could be a relational database, it could be, a bunch of CSVs or anything that you've gotten on. You can use the data movement SDK and the Java client API to facilitate getting data from your source into MarkLogic. All right. So to recap, I've given you 3 recipes. Build and deploy using the MarkLogic Gradle plugin. I've showed you how to run automated testing. There's a client called the ML-JUnit. It's just an extension of the JUnit test library that's out there, but it's got some helper classes to help with easing to running these unit tests across the REST client API. And finally, I'm giving you some starter code to help give you a template for how you can take data from a source like a relational database and push that into MarkLogic via the new feature of the Data Movement SDK in MarkLogic 9. With that, do we have any questions? I got the 10-minute, which means yes? I don't see why not. I mean, what is configurable is the batch size, so how many you write at one time. You can configure the number of threads that are allocated for each one of those batches. If you're writing to multiple databases, multiple relational databases, I would recommend a separate batch processing program per database. Because the SQL query that you're going to use to extract out the data and then the transform that you need is going to be unique for each database. So you'll need a batch processing program per database. Yes, sir? No, Roxy was conceived and developed before the management REST API was delivered by our engineering team. It uses the xQuery admin API to execute those same configuration deployment tasks. There's nothing wrong with Roxy, but I highly encourage you to use a tool. Anything that wraps around the management API is really where you should be going, because engineering is responsible for that surface area. So when we do we've made actually quite a number of improvements through our use of ML Gradle, and engineering's been pretty quick about releasing those changes upon each minor release that we have. So if you are using Roxy now, a great tool, but I highly advise migrating to something like ML Gradle. And we're actually, in the community, we're actually trying to work on a path of how people could go from Roxy to ML Gradle. Yes?
What do you think due to the configuration, the response time?
The question was, what was the impact of?
What is the impact of configuration introducing?
So the question was, what's the impact of ingest processes and search processes happening at the same time? Really, you need to have some sort of idea of your thresholds, of how many concurrent ingestion and queries you are having at the same time, and size your hardware appropriately to those thresholds. So that's more of a sizing issue, hardware sizing issue, number of cores per farce and so forth.
Are there any queries that can be set for configuration? So there are some parallel threads going on. So I want all of the threads to be having the same more stuff so that I can put the query configuration in one queue.
There are a couple so the question was, are there any priority settings that you can assign to certain application threads that are being initiated from the outside? Yes, there is some configuration on the app server that can facilitate some of that. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but there is some configuration for that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You know, like you're using Spring batch framework underneath it. So can we change Spring batch configuration, like number of
Yeah, I mean, you could, if you find another batch processing framework that you like. Remember, DMSDK really just deals with the batching and writing and querying to MarkLogic. There's a whole prelude of stuff that happens, the extraction of your data from the database, transforming it into a document format. We use Spring Batch for facilitating that. You could use whatever batch processing framework, Python, whatever, to accomplish that mission. I like Spring Batch just because it kind of does a lot of that stuff out of the box. The learning curve is a bit steep, but once you get over that and are comfortable with like Spring Framework type of concepts, it's a framework that I recommend. Yes?
Where does a framework like Spring Batch start and end, and where does the data movement SDK begin and end?
Okay.
Where's the overlap?
At a high level, Spring Batch deals with reading data from a source, processing like a batch of rows, like transforming them potentially, and then writing it to MarkLogic. So in the MarkLogic Spring Batch project that we have in our community website, we have extended Spring Batch that deals with basically writing and reading and some other kind of miscellaneous type of task. So the idea is you might have a MarkLogic item writer, which takes a URI, some document metadata, and the document content itself in a handle, and then the item writer is responsible for taking that and putting it into MarkLogic. So you would actually be abstracted away from the implementation. You might, for some people, DMSDK might not be the answer because it's asynchronous, and you might need to have some sort of transactional support when you're writing data. So you could use a MarkLogic item writer that used DMSDK, or a different variant of a MarkLogic item writer that used, a document write set, which batches up a bunch of documents in an HTTP request and pushes them in. So Spring Batch would kind of abstract away which implementation you would use, and you would probably just have a configuration of some sort to either use DMSDK or the normal REST client API, the V1 documents endpoint. Any other questions? I want to thank you guys for listening today. I appreciate your attention. I know you had a long day today. Go out, enjoy yourself. I'm the warm-up app for the second city troop today. I appreciate some of the laughs and some of the blank stares that I got from you all today. Thank you for listening.